Good morning, class. My name is Natango Monica. I am presenting a topic on money and inflation. Inflation is one of the macroeconomic problems facing the world economies today, especially in terms of affecting demand, loss in value of wages, production, and many other macroeconomic variables. Others have defined others have defined inflation as a persistent and appreciable rise in general price levels and average prices within an economy. According to Geoffrey, 1948, inflation is a situation under which the value of money is falling within an economy. So different people are defining inflation differently. But at the end of the day, they are trying to explain one thing, that this is where we have a general price increase or persistent increase in the general price levels of goods and services in an economy. So the prices keep increasing generally, not for only one particular good or service, but for all the goods and services in an economy. So you find that all the prices are increasing for goods, for services. For example, transportation is increasing, medical centers are increasing, buying commodities in markets, in shops is increasing. So all the prices for goods and services are increasing in an economy. That's what we call inflation. Money loses value. So inflation can be good or can also be bad. So today we are going to look at what money and inflation is all about. What is the connection between money and inflation? But before we understand that connection, we've got to first understand what is inflation. In our previous classes, we've been understanding money. We've been studying what money is. We had an introduction of what money is. We looked at money demand and money supply. And right now we are looking at money and inflation. What causes it? What are the remedies? What theories have been derived, have been formulated to explain what inflation is all about? So in this lecture, let's look at classification of inflation. Inflation can be categorized into two. We have what we call a creeping inflation. This is the persistent rise in prices of about 2% annually. This kind of inflation has one basic feature, that the annual price rise is almost imperceptible, which means that meaning it's not easily observed by the public. The public may not be it may not be easy for the public to observe this kind of inflation. It doesn't cause chaos in a country. You may not even know the prices are increasing. When you go to the shops, you find that they have increased. Maybe something which was bought at 400 is now at 500. So you may find that it doesn't really cause a lot of problems in a country. This is an inflation which is a bit slow. It is slow. It doesn't cause problems in an economy. So this is what we call a creeping inflation. It's important to know that controlling creeping inflation may prove disastrous to one economy, given that it accelerates the volume of business. Remember, inflation, since it's a persistent increase in the general price levels of goods and services, in one way or the other, it motivates producers to remain in business. It increases production in an economy. So controlling creeping inflation, you may find that as policymaker, they will be demoralizing the production to take place, which in the end is going to reduce the amount of goods in an economy, which is going to reduce aggregate supply in an economy. So it's not really good to reduce this kind of inflation. Then another form of inflation is what we call a hyperinflation. Hyperinflation occurs when there is a monthly rise in prices of about 50% or more. In such a situation, economists maintain that economy in facing astronomical rise in prices, and money becomes almost worthless in terms of value. So this is why you see that a lot of money is buying few items. Money loses value. You go to a supermarket with an M and come out with a small Cavera, whereby you've not even purchased anything much. So examples of countries that have faced such an inflation is Germany in 1923 and then 1947. China has also gone through the same in 1949, and of recent Zimbabwe, even South Sudan recently. That's the same challenge. So this kind of inflation is very dangerous. It's very disastrous to one economy, where you find that even governments have been overthrown. You find that people have killed each other because of this kind of inflation. So with hyperinflation, the transaction demand for money becomes irrational, and agents prefer the speculative demand for money because inflation raises the nominal rate of interest. So this kind of inflation is dangerous, and it calls for policy actions. It calls for policy formulations. So let's look at theories of inflation. Theories of inflation. Now, many theories have been formulated to explain why inflation exists in countries. And let me take you back a little bit. No country doesn't have inflation. All countries do have inflation. But the question is, at what rate is the inflation rate in Uganda? At what rate is it in Kenya? At what rate is it in Rwanda? At what rate is it in US and other powerful countries? So inflation can be caused by so many things. But what do some scholars say about it? What do some schools of thought explain as the cause of inflation in economies? So let's say the monetarists. So the monetarists, headed by Milton Friedman, advanced the monetarist model, which observes inflation as essentially a result of money supply. Remember, we have been discussing money supply. So money supply, this is the amount of money in circulation. This is the amount of money available for spending by economic agents. So the amount of money that is available for spending, we are looking at demand deposits, time deposits. We are looking at currency in circulation. We are looking at all those forms of money that are available for spending by the public. So when you look at the monetarists, for them they think that inflation could be as a result of money supply. Probably money supply has exceeded the demand for money. So in the end, the result is inflation. They observe that if the amount of money supply exceeds the amount of money demanded, a surplus of money will result into increased demands of output and reduced bargaining power. So this means to the monetarists, any necessary and sufficient condition of controlling inflation should be based on controlling the rate of money supply growth so that it is consistent with the rate of demand for money. So according to the monetarists, for them they look at inflation as a result of increased supply of money. And according to them, if you want to control this kind of inflation, then there is no way you'll do other things. You just have to control the rate of money supply in an economy. You just have to tamper with the supply of money so that it matches the rate of demand for this particular money. And then you'll have controlled inflation in your country. So we shall look at various ways in which money supply can be controlled. And particularly, we have what we call the fiscal and monetary policies. So the classical view. What does the classical view say? That causes inflation. So this emphasizes the basic structure of the economy and the rigidities as major causes of inflation. The classical economists maintain that inflation is purely a monetary phenomenon. So when you look at a classical view, it has some tendencies like the monetarists. They base their argument on the Irving Fisher's quantity theory of money, which is such that the value of sales equals the values of receipts. As you see, this is the Irving Fisher's quantity theory of money, where we have money supply and the demand for money on the other side. So they also assert that the structure of an economy and the rigidities in that economy cause inflation. There are major causes of inflation. What about the Keynesian What about the Keynesian view? Keynesian analysis indicates that the continually increasing money supply will have the same effect on the aggregate demand and supply curves. The aggregate demand curve will keep on shifting to the right, and the supply curve will keep shifting inwards. The only difference in the two is that Keynesians believe that the aggregate supply curve would shift in more slowly than do the monetaries. Thus, Keynesian analysis suggests that output might tend to stay above the natural rate longer than the monetaries. The conclusion is the same one the monetaries find. A rapidly growing money supply will cause the price level to rise continually at a high rate, thus generating inflation. So when you look at them, at all these schools of thought, they're almost similar to each other. So even the Keynesian is telling you that if the money supply is growing rapidly, this will cause the price levels to rise continually, and hence having inflation in your country. Then the structural economists, what do they say? Now the structuralists, these ones are such that the causes of inflation must be sought in certain structural features of developing countries or developing economies, which make them particularly inflation prone compared to developed nations. They observe that developing nations have many structural breakdowns, shock bottlenecks, which cause a fall in levels of production and consequently perpetual inflation. I'll take an example. When you look at our infrastructure, how are our roads? So you find that transporting commodities from villages or from rural areas to the marketplaces, it is quite difficult, which in the end is going to reduce supply. And when supply reduces and demand exceeds supply, then there will be inflation in a country. Take an example, look at buildings. We don't even have enough markets in our economies as developing countries. So this causes inflation in a way that we find that there is a lot of issues, that lead to decrease decrease in supply of commodities and services, skills and experience. Take an example, if you have very few doctors in Uganda, what will happen? They are going to price themselves highly. You will find that they are going to price themselves, they're so expensive. If you have very few accountants, if you have very few auditors, that means that their price will be very expensive compared to countries or economies that have them in plenty. This is what we call structural economies. The education system in our country, how is it? The roads, they're full of potholes. So you find that cars do not want to go and pick commodities from there and bring them to markets. So hence causing inflation in our economies. So the structural bottlenecks, this is according to the structural economists. For them, they think many developing countries are having a high inflation rate compared to other developed countries because of these bottlenecks, because of these structural rigidities that they face as nations. So this is a formula that explains that explains the structure, the structural Keynesian, classical, and all these schools of thought that explain the causes of inflation, but particularly the classical school of thought, the monetary school of thought, and even the Keynesian school of thought, the ones that look at the change in money supply and general price levels with respect to time. So that's what we're looking at as causes of inflation. So let's also look at major or general causes of inflation. Besides that, looking at the schools of thought that have been advanced to explain this, let's also have a look at the general causes of inflation. One, money supply. Now you find that even the schools of thought have advanced this as one of the major points as that causes inflation in economies. An increase in money supply, which can be denoted by MS, results in an increase in price levels. As we said earlier on, that whenever supply of money increases, this will result into increase in price levels. How? Because you will find that you will find that the producers, the suppliers will assume people have money. Hmm? So that the bargaining power is going to decrease. There will be low bargaining power. People will buy what they want, and they're going to buy everything, and the demand exceeds supply in the end, supply of commodities. And whenever there's the producers or the suppliers sense any willingness from the demand side to increase prices, they will surely increase prices, because for them they are actually after it. The supply shocks is the second one. This was actually also advanced by the structuralists. With the occurrence of supply disturbances, which may result from the changes in prices from raw materials, workers demanding for higher wages, fall in supply of oil, and so many other things. Now, when you look at supply shocks, you may look at things like maybe technology. Those things that really affect the supply of products. When they become scarce, when they become expensive, when they become so hard to find, this in the end is going to be is going to affect the production of goods and services, and the increment is going to be felt in the general price levels of these particular goods and services. So we have the cost push inflation. The cost push inflation. This occurs because of negative supply shocks, international fuel shortages, or a push by workers to get higher wages. Sometimes we, the workers, also cause inflation, which can be classified under cost push inflation. How? Every time we ask for higher wages, we are pushing pressure, we are putting pressure onto the bosses, onto the manufacturers, and to the owners, and for them, they have to pass on to this onto the consumers or the customers in form of increased prices. So this is one of the cost push inflation example. But also advanced technology, expensive technology. If they're using expensive technology and they want to get out the money that was incurred in expenses, then they've got to do that as increment in prices of goods and services. Talk about government taxes, government policies, particularly through taxing. Now, if the government taxes these companies highly, expensively, then they're going to transfer this onto us, the consumers and their clients, in form of increased prices, and hence inflation too. So these are examples that causes cost push inflation. Higher prices of commodities, a rise. We have imported inflation, we have higher wages, we have higher taxes, we have profit push inflation. If firms gain increased monopoly power, they are in position to push up prices to make more profits. And then we also have the demand pull inflation. Demand pull inflation, which results when policymakers pursue policies that shift out the aggregate demand curve. This is another way that the goal of high employment can lead to inflationary monetary policy. So even at whenever aggregate demand exceeds aggregate supply, this also causes inflation. I take an example. This can be related to money supply. When the government formulates policies that favor them to demand highly, then automatically it will put more money in the hands of the public, which in the end is going to cause a higher demand compared to supply, and in the end causing inflation in the economy. So these are the causes of demand pull inflation: consumption, we have the exchange rate, we have the government spending, expectations, and monetary growth. So all these ones can be associated to demand pull inflation. We look at demand pull inflation as aggregate demand exceeding aggregate supply. And what can cause aggregate demand to increase? Look at government spending. Now, when you look at government spending, sometimes what does government spend its money on is very, very, very necessary. It's very, very critical. What does your government spend money on? At the end of the day, the government itself can end up causing inflation. Remember, if the government gets money and doesn't put it in productive ventures, take an example, increasing salaries of civil servants. By the way, even in one way or the other, corruption can also cause inflation, because this is money that cannot be accounted for. So it can also cause inflation without you knowing. So we have monetary growth. This is also whereby the monetary base increases, the monetary supply increases in. So we are looking at a control of inflation. How do we control inflation? Now it's very difficult to get rid of inflation completely, because remember, as I told you earlier on, that getting rid of it completely is also dangerous, because it's going to lower production, which in the end is going to lower the output and hence affecting the GDP of an economy. So even when you're as policy makers, as decision makers, they've got to be very careful on how they handle inflation as a macroeconomic variable, so as to stabilize the economy in that particular period of time. So one of the policies that is used for controlling inflation is monetary policy. And under monetary policy, this is where the government, through the central bank, tries to reduce money supply. This MS is money supply. Tries to reduce money supply through its operations. So the government uses the central bank to handle this kind of problem, to handle inflation. So this is what we call monetary policy. And monetary policy, there are different tools that are used under monetary policy to control inflation. One is what we call the open market operations. The open market operations is an important tool under which central bank sells a bulk of government securities to the public. As the result, the amount of cash balances reduces from the hands of the public. So OMO is one of the most important tools that can help to control or to reduce or to curb inflation in an economy. And then we have what we call the bank rate. We have the bank rate. The bank rate is also very, very important. The bank rate as monetary tool for controlling inflation. This is the rate at which commercial banks borrow from the central bank. If the central bank is interested in controlling inflation, the bank rate is increased to reduce the rate of borrowing by commercial banks, thus controlling the amount of vulnerable funds. Now, when you look at these tools, they can be used as contractionary monetary policies, and they can also be used as expansionary monetary policies. What do I mean? When they want to increase the amount of money in circulation, assuming our aggregate demand is low, what they will do, they will apply what we call expansionary monetary policies. And if they want to reduce the amount of money in circulation, they will apply what we call the contractionary monetary policies. So it is the same tool under monetary policy that will be used differently regarding to what the policymakers are interested in. Are they interested in reducing the money supply or increasing the money supply? They will apply the same tool but differently depending on the outcome that they're chasing, or depending on the objective of this particular tool they're trying to implement. So we also have the fiscal policy. It's also very important. Now, the monetary policy doesn't have only those two tools I've looked at, the bank rate and the OMO. It has very many other tools that you can read about in your free time. Let's look at fiscal policy. Now, fiscal policy, this is a reduction in government expenditure and an increase in taxation, reduce the public's purchasing power, thus price rises can be controlled. Now, fiscal policy is particularly the behavior of government regarding spending or regarding expenditure. So the government, the central government, can also increase or reduce money in the public. They can also be used to control inflation through their different tools. So even fiscal policy has certain tools it uses so as to either increase or decrease the amount of money in circulation. And one of the tools that is very common to us is what we call the budget. The budget is used under fiscal policy to control the amount of money in circulation. Now, when you look at the budget, normally it involves taxation. Taxation, the increased taxes or reduce the taxes. So that they're trying either to increase money in circulation or to reduce money in circulation through this particular tool under fiscal policy. We have the income policy, and with the income policy, this concerns fixing of maximum wage levels to be received by workers in the economy. So this policy requires regulating of incomes, because as we explained earlier on, you may find that higher incomes in the end also cause inflation when it leads to aggregate demand exceeding aggregate supply in an economy. So there is need to have an income policy. What is the maximum wage level that an economy should have so as to be able to control inflation in that particular economy? So we have the pricing policies. Many of us are aware of the maximum price levels regulation, minimum price regulation. Some of these prices policy or pricing policy, they can be put to control inflation. That this is the highest price you can set for commodities in markets. It is very relevant for policymakers to think about pricing policies, because these are also very critical in causing inflation in the country. We have the production policies. Under this, the government is required to design and implement policies aimed at increasing the country's productive capacity. The government is required to do whatever it takes to increase production and avoid shortages in markets. Take an example. They can decide to give tax, they can allow them to produce a tax-free rate. They can ban taxes on a particular commodity, or they can decide to give them a tax holiday. You know, many companies in Uganda have been given tax holidays, and this is hoping to increase production, to increase capacity, to increase output in that particular sector, where they see that inflation is really penetrating. When they sense that there is a limited output in this particular production or in this production of goods and services, they can find ways of increasing production. Maybe they can also increase it through lending money, to producers, so as to boost production, to increase capacity, so that aggregate supply is